All right, thanks, Janet. See, I'm the book guy, Brian. Which is why I was so attracted to Brian, who's a Harvard and Princeton grad, right? So we met back in the 2000s, early 2000s.
Great job making him not listen to him.
Right, now he's worried about you not listening, right? Anyway, no, I thought I can test my theological chops on this guy, you know. So these are 5 books that I would highly recommend for the whole issue of full acceptance of LGBTQ plus people in the church, all right? And if you are a theological nerd and you wonder about this, these are 5 books. I'm going to leave them up here. You can come take pictures of them. But these are some of my 5 favorites. I checked them with Brian, and he said there's some of his as well. So we're dealing with a topic called the secret struggles of skepticism. We've been doing this over the last several weeks. I've been taking the top 7 topics where people have wrestled with, and many people have exited the church because of these topics. And so we just tackled them head on. And we're not trying to give all the perfect answers to everything, but we are trying to raise the issues, get you thinking. I like to say questions, doubts, and the struggle of belief and disbelief are a part of the normal spiritual journey. So many times in the past, I've seen people actually frown upon questions and doubts, but if you read the Bible and all the people in it, everybody there had those things that went on. It's a part of being human. So I love to talk about these things. So Brian and I met back in, early 2000s. He became the pastor of Parkville Presbyterian Church in 1999 and pastored that until 2012. I had planted a church in Kansas City in 1990, and so when he came on board at Parkville Presbyterian, one of us reached out to each other, and we started having dinners together. We've gone to a couple of Royals games together. He's a big NAIA fan. I've been going to the NAIA since 1968, and he's been the scorekeeper, basically, official scorekeeper for the NAIA for 20 years now. So when my dad and I go, I'm always texting Brian, and we wave at him across the way, down at the scores table. So Brian resigned in 2012. He's going to be sharing his story. And I'd asked him to come on a couple of other occasions that finally worked out. I'm so honored to have Brian here. I grew up Southern Baptist. I went to Baylor and Southwestern Baptist Seminary. I did a bachelor's and master's, and the topic of LGBTQ plus never came up. It was like gay people didn't exist or something, or if they did and they were in the Southern Baptist world, they didn't admit it, right? And so it was later when I started pastoring that people started showing up at Vineyard who were wrestling with that issue. And I would have thought, well, it's probably a sin just like my sins. I think we all need grace and that kind of thing. But as I pastored people and developed friendships with people, Paige would be one of these people. Paige was in my church in the 90s. And I started just realizing how hard. So I had one friend say for 20 years, he went to college, seminary, got married, tried to pray the gay away, did every kind of therapy possible. And he said after 20 years of trying to not be gay and pray the gay away, he said, I hated myself more and I felt 1% less gay. And I just started watching how the destruction of people's self-esteem and their very core beings were being challenged by a hurtful doctrine. So it made me re-examine my own perspective on the Bible. These are some of the books that I would recommend. But people like Brian, a good close friend, are really what moved me and changed me, because I knew Brian, I knew his heart, and I knew his story to some degree, though he wasn't fully comfortable sharing with Pastor Fred, who was the conservative megachurch pastor in those early days, right? So let's welcome Brian Ellison. By the way, he is the executive director of Covenant Network of the Presbyterians, which is an executive group that helps churches in America move into an open and affirming stance in their relationship to the LGBTQ plus community. So let's welcome Brian Ellison today. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you so much, Fred. It is really an honor and a privilege for me to be with you all after pastoring a church a mile or two away for many years. I was, in fact, aware of your church. I said to Fred this morning, this is the first time I've set foot in this building since this addition was built. But when Laura was getting things started, I knew Laura, and we were all part of the ministerial alliance together, and so actually was really excited about what was happening here. But I'm glad to get to know you for real, in real life now. And Fred is not wrong. I liked Fred. I liked him enough to go to Royals games with him. But I didn't completely trust Fred. And that reality is part of what I want to talk about today, because I think it's a reality that people in the LGBTQIA+ community that people outside of that community don't always understand about us, especially in a church. Especially in this place that we have set aside and said, this is your safe space. This is where God and you get to meet and interact. This is the place where community represents the reign of Christ, the kingdom of God. And yet we don't always feel safe or loved or included, even in churches that are trying to do the right thing. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. And as Fred has asked me to, I'm going to start by sharing a little of my own story, which is something I didn't ever do at Parkville Presbyterian Church in those 13 years. And I'm going to start way back to my growing up in a Presbyterian church, a loving, sweet, wonderful congregation out in Washington State, where I learned Bible verses and I learned about caring for people. And I actually got to be a deacon of the church when I was a teenager, and that was fun. It's also a place where I got to preach for the first time on youth Sundays. My grandmother was the longest serving member of that church. She lived to age 111, so she held that title for a long time. But she actually shared it with my father, who joined when he was 10 years old and is still a member of that church. So is my stepmother. My brother-in-law is one of the pastors there. My aunt was the clerk of session, kind of the head layperson. It's my family's church. It's also a church that is no longer part of the Presbyterian Church USA, because the Presbyterian Church USA ordains people like me. That's the church I grew up in, a church where I learned about God and God's love, but where I learned at some point it wasn't okay to acknowledge these things I was feeling, because even as a teenage boy, I knew I was gay. But I kind of pushed that down because it didn't make sense for me to think that a Christian could be gay, and so I didn't talk about it. And I went off to college. Yes, as Fred mentioned, it was at Harvard, which would have been a pretty safe place to be out. But I was part of a very conservative campus ministry group, which was a gift. I got to lead Bible studies and got to lead meetings. I also taught fourth grade Sunday school at a church I was attending. But again, the message was clear that if I was honest about these thoughts and feelings, I wouldn't have been able to do those things. I wouldn't have been affirmed by that community. And so, again, because of my Christian faith practices, I suppressed who I actually was. I went to seminary, Princeton Seminary. There were a few openly LGBTQ people, although there were a lot more who were not open. In fact, the LGBT student group at that time met in an undisclosed location. If you wanted to meet there, you had to go to a particular secretary in a particular office on campus and ask her when the meetings were, because that was the only way they could be safe and not afraid to be outed and possibly have an end put to their ministries. Now, that year, I'm going to tell you, was 1995 that I started seminary. And that's important because of what was happening in the Presbyterian Church at that time. In 1996, the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church adopted a policy They added it to our church constitution. And I know this is a disciples' church. You have a congregational polity. Every individual church gets to make a lot of its own individual decisions. The Presbyterian Church is a lot more hierarchical in its rules. And in 1996, the Presbyterian Church set a rule that said, in more or less, in complicated language, but basically said, practicing LGBTQ people, so in any gay or lesbian or bisexual person who was acting out that life even in a mutually committed relationship, could not be ordained as a minister or an elder or deacon in the Presbyterian Church. And that was adopted first by the General Assembly and then by the majority of the regional bodies around the country. And that happened my second year of seminary. So any thought I might have had of coming out, of being honest with myself and with others about who I was, had to be I had to make a choice, really. I could do that, and some people did, but it meant they weren't going to be ministers. I felt deeply called to ministry. I felt God was drawing me to a life of service in the church. I felt like I had the gifts for it. I felt like I had responsibilities to do it. And at the thought of changing denominations, I have sometimes joked that I'm more Presbyterian than I am gay. And so that didn't seem like an option either. And so in the end, I, again, just didn't talk about it. And I think I also was living with a little magical thinking. I was telling myself that maybe it'll change. Maybe I will meet the right woman and she'll sweep me off my feet. Maybe I will acquire somehow the spiritual gift of celibacy. And in any case, when I was ordained in 1999, under this new church policy, I wasn't violating it. And I got called, much to my surprise, as a kid who grew up in Washington State and went to school on the East Coast, I was called to Kansas City, Missouri, to the coast of the Missouri River. And had an incredibly rich, spirit-filled ministry of 13 years at Parkville Presbyterian. I loved that church, still love that church, actually. A couple things about that time, though. So I started in 99. It went really well. Church was growing. Good things were happening. I was so busy that I wasn't really thinking about my sexual identity that much. But after a few years, I realized I did not have the spiritual gift of celibacy. I was not called to a life of singleness. I longed to be in relationship. I started to date quietly, very, very quietly. In 2003, I met my now partner of 22 years, Troy. Troy and I, as it became clear that our relationship was going to last, this was serious, started to have some decisions to make. What was that going to mean for our life together and for my life as a minister? I thought that one option would be to sort of just come out, let the chips fall where they may. Tell the congregation, this is who I am, deal with it, and see what would happen. And a lot of people would have supported me if I had done that. But not everyone. It wasn't part of the deal when they hired me. I had not been honest enough with myself or with them for it to be. So that didn't seem fair to them. It would have caused division in the church. It certainly would have been a conflict. That didn't seem like the right thing to do. I thought that I could maybe quietly step away. Just time to go. I know the church is growing. I know we just started a building project. I know we just called an associate pastor. But it just seems like this is what I need to do. That didn't seem faithful either. That didn't seem right. Didn't seem fair to that church. It has been pointed out to me another option I had would have been to actually end my relationship and try again at that singleness thing. But that didn't seem faithful, and in any case wouldn't have solved the problem. So in the end, for many years, I simply didn't talk about it at church. Troy and I grew in our relationship. Friends knew. Some of my colleagues. A very small handful of folks in the church knew. Russell is here. Russell was part of the church at that time. But most did not, because it wasn't something I could share under the policies of the church. I'm going to fast forward to the end of my time at Parkville in 2012. Enough people out in the church knew, out in the larger national church knew, that when it was time for this organization I now lead, the Covenant Network of Presbyterians, which was founded, by the way, back in 1997, right after that policy was adopted. It was founded explicitly to change the church's policy. And in 2011, they successfully did so. The whole church did so. The Presbyterian Church became, it started to allow the ordination of LGBTQ people. Now, I want to put parentheses around that. They started to allow it, doesn't mean everybody was excited to do it. But they did start to allow it in 2011. And that, in theory, would allow me to come out. People started to ask me if I would consider taking over this organization where the founding executive director had just retired. And in 2012, I accepted that position. And I wrote a letter to the Parkville Church, and in the same letter, I told them I was leaving after 13 years as their pastor, and also, I'm gay. And Troy, that person who has built a lot of vacation Bible school sets for you, and occasionally brought lemon squares to coffee hours, that's my partner. And then I had 6 more weeks as their pastor. I gave them 6 weeks' notice. I have to tell you, the hardest conversations of my ministry, but also the best conversations of my ministry, were during those 6 weeks. They were the best because they were conducted with absolute authenticity. You now knew who you were getting. But they were hard. The hardest ones were not with the more conservative folks. They were not with the folks who were having a hard time with this homosexuality thing. There were some of those, but that wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was with the people who were completely supportive, who looked at me and said, "How could you not tell us? You prayed with my mother at her bedside as she was dying. You did our premarital counseling. How could you not share this most important part of your life with us?" And you know what? They were absolutely right. There is a problem in the church when we can't be honest with each other, when we can't be fully who we are. And that reality still informs the work I do after 13 years of being part of the Covenant Network of Presbyterians, whose mission has shifted from trying to change church policies to trying to help the church live into the policies it's decided to adopt. 2 years after I started, we successfully helped the Presbyterian Church approve same-sex marriage in our churches. But even a decade after that, we're still struggling to help churches really understand what it would mean to affirm, to welcome, to love, and in their policies to ordain and to marry LGBTQ people. Now, why is that so hard? I think there's actually a lot of reasons. My story, I think, tells that story in a microcosm, but I think it reflects a journey that a lot of people, a lot of Christians, a lot of Christian churches are on. Even well-meaning, even progressive Christians. I think often we start by hearing about something and our brain or our teaching or our background tells us that is sin. And then we move to a place of saying, okay, it's not sin, but I'm just not very comfortable with it. And then the people who are trying to be on a journey not knowing what to do not talking about it create a place where there's inauthenticity, a place where people aren't honest because it would be uncomfortable to be honest. And then we come finally to a place of saying, why don't we just not do things that will cause conflict? Live and let live. You know, I often say that the biggest challenge I face today is not argument. I don't go out and visit a lot of churches and people yell at me or hurl insults at the queer community. That doesn't happen to me very often. Once in a while. Not very often. What I battle today is complacency. It's the belief that, hey, we've made all this progress. Hey, the world has changed. Hey, we have gay ministers in this church. And they think that the work is done. But I'm sorry to say it isn't. LGBTQIA plus people do not believe generally that they're going to be welcomed in a church. Now, I know there are LGBTQIA plus siblings here today, and every person's story is different, every person's experience is different. I don't mean to pretend to speak for everyone. But I will say that in the years I've been doing this, generally speaking, a queer person who's thinking about going to a church needs an extra measure of assurance that that place is going to be a safe place for them. It is not enough to see a banner over the door that says, "All are welcome." We had one of those at Parkville, by the way, Parkville Pres. It was true. It actually was true. It would have, every person in that church would have said that any other person is welcome there. But an LGBTQIA plus person doesn't believe that. They don't think it means them. And for a lot of us, that's born out of personal experience. We've been welcomed before, only to be told that we are lesser, that, yeah, it's no different than my sin, but you're a sinner for that. And that's not okay. That's not what a person comes to church for. And unwilling to take that risk, we're not going to come. So I help churches understand what it means truly to be affirming. Often with a church, we start with education. We start with LGBTQ 101. What do those letters stand for? What is sexual orientation? What is gender identity? Part of being a church that is intentional about its welcome, about its affirmation, is being able to talk about those things and not treat those like icky words. These books that Fred has a stack of here, they are great examples of books, every one of those that I have seen churches take and spend time with. Maybe it's a small group at first, but they become comfortable talking about something that becomes an acceptable part of the church's vocabulary, just as we might talk about whether the church is a good place for kids or a good place for people of different marital backgrounds or of different races. We can speak the language, and that's so important. Another thing that's really important, and it's something I commend your church for doing, is to take a moment to discern, to decide, this is who we are. So the sign out front that indicates you're part of the Disciples LGBTQ affirming group, organization, is really important. It's why I say folks need to join the Covenant Network of Presbyterians or More Light Presbyterians, another group that does this. It says to the world, we're not just trying, we've decided that this is who we are and that we're on this journey. That really matters, and it matters to LGBTQ folks. A third thing that I talk, and this is actually where I spend most of my time with churches, is about practical actions, steps that churches can take to be more intentional about their inclusion, about their welcome. A lot of those steps are steps of hospitality. They're steps of thinking about the words we say and the actions we take on a Sunday morning and at other times to really create safe and inclusive spaces. just as an example, I think a group within the LGBTQIA plus community that is particularly vulnerable at this moment in our society are trans and non-binary people. I think the church does a historically bad job of creating safe and affirming spaces for people of diverse gender identities. And we do it in intentional ways sometimes, but we do it more often, I think, in unintentional ways. The number of churches I talk with about their restroom situation, you'd think I'm a plumbing engineer or something. But the reality is that may seem like such a small thing, but it's a huge thing. If you go to a space where you can't pee without feeling awkward, without being at risk, without not being sure if someone's going to give you a weird look, that's not a safe space. And so being intentional about that, not only does the presence of an all-gender restroom create a safer space, it also says to everybody, including the people who aren't trans or non-binary, this is the kind of church we are. We think about this. We care about this. I also encourage churches to take intentional steps in their publicity, in how they present themselves to each other and to the world. Think about the images you present on your website. Is every picture of a happy family of a mother and father and two very cute children? Or do you show the full diversity of your church? Do you consider putting out a sign that has rainbow colors or that explicitly says LGBTQ people are welcome here? It makes a difference in what people believe about your church. And then I encourage folks to think about their acts of engagement in their communities. And every church is different. Churches engage community in different ways. But I encourage folks to think about things like where they will show a public witness. You know, there are plenty of people who are willing to go speak at a school board meeting or a city council hearing or a state legislative committee and say, in the name of Jesus, that homosexuality is wrong. There are plenty of people willing to say that this book that shows an affirming perspective on transgender people should not be in our library because of their Christian faith. When a Christian goes and says, my Christian faith compels me to love, my Christian faith demands that this person's life be affirmed as a child of God, as someone created in God's image, it is still powerful. It matters that we as Christians speak of our faith in ways that welcome all of God's people and affirm them. You know, to wrap up, I think that we are in an interesting moment. That's the most nonpartisan way I can say that. But the very concept behind this sermon series of dealing with skepticism, dealing with the challenges to faith that a lot of us carry, I think that the reality of this moment compels us to really look to the situation of our LGBTQIA plus siblings and think, how is it that we move forward? How is it that we as a church can do better, but also learn from that journey? I believe that the way forward that has been modeled for us, that has worked, is when we confront things together, when we lift up who we are as community, our skepticism, our individual doubt, and our individual struggle start to be defeated. I think when we live intentionally in community, we are going to help make sure that individuals aren't left behind. And most of all, when we cultivate a space that is filled with authenticity, that is where we can carry those doubts, carry that skepticism, carry the fullness of our identity, scary though it may be, we will be a place that actually shows forth the reign of God, that actually shows forth the community that God created, that Christ died and rose for, and that the Holy Spirit promises to infuse even this day. So may that be so. Amen.